This program is brought to you by Emory University.
All right, well, welcome everyone to this presentation by visiting scholar Wendy Hesford from The Ohio State University. She's going to be presenting today on vulnerabilities, child soldiers as human rights subjects. I also wanted to alert you to some events happening this weekend, important in the life of the Feminism and Legal Theory Project. We're having our 30th anniversary gala dinner on Friday night, which comes right in the midst of our workshop this weekend on labor and employment, which is the final in the series of 4 workshops as the FLT at 30 series for this year.
So is the FLT now going out of business?
No, this is the start of the next 30 years. So if you are interested in attending either of those, I think everyone here is registered for those. So we look forward to seeing you later on this weekend. But let's welcome Wendy here for the presentation today.
Well, thank you all for coming. And what I thought I would do very briefly is just talk a little bit about my current research project to contextualize what I'm doing with this essay, which is really just a short essay at this point. And I'm not a lawyer. Should probably disclose that. My background is actually in literature and rhetorical theory, especially. And I brought a copy of my last book. It's a rough copy of it because I've been, lugging it around. But I wasn't sure if people were even familiar with some of the work that I've done in the past. But this recent book is about visual representations of human rights and the ways in which human rights organizations, artists, humanities scholars, critical theorists mobilize the visual in order to draw attention to human rights atrocities. And the book is also about not just the possibilities of the visual, but also the limitations of what I call the ocular centricity of human rights discourse, that is so much emphasis on the visual as a way to provide evidence for suffering, but also empowerment. So my work, that was my earlier work. And the last chapter of that book, not the conclusion, but the last kind of case study chapter, was on representations of children growing up in brothels or child sex workers. And I was looking primarily at film, documentary film. And I looked at Born into Brothels, which some of you may have seen. It was an Academy Award-winning film in, was it like 2005, I think. A Kind of Childhood, another film, and a study by Heather Montgomery called Modern Babylon about children working in the sex industry in Thailand, which is an ethnographic work. So that just got me very interested in representations of children's human rights. So I come at it not from a practitioner viewpoint, but from a humanities viewpoint, and looking at the way in which these issues are represented in mass media, how the law or certain parts of international human rights law gets translated into cultural texts or cultural productions, literature, film, etc. So I'm always so grateful when I have people with, in legal studies and lawyers listening to my work to help me ground it even more clearly in some of the legal issues, since my focus is so much on the rhetorical and the persuasive. Does this persuade, in what context, this representation or not? On the PowerPoint handout, I won't go over it, and it's very small. I'm sorry, the only way to get it on a slide. I should have separated it. But I'm working on 2 projects, of which this is related. One is a special issue of, I believe it'll be in Feminist Formations, that we're finalizing that with the editorial staff there. And it's a collection called Global Human Rights, Sexualities, and Vulnerabilities, which grew out of a symposium that Amy Schumann and I, she's in folklore, put together at Ohio State. It was a big full-day faculty and students symposium on those issues. So we issued a call for papers to just broaden out what we're doing with that special issue. Anyone interested in a larger version could email me and I could just send you the text. And the other project that I'm working on that dovetails, I think, with the work that's going on in the initiative here is my next book project, which I'm calling Exceptional Rhetorics, Regulating Childhood and Children's Rights, which will focus on mass media, literary, cinematic, and activist representations of children's human rights at the turn of the 21st century, with particular attention to children living in states of political exception and social exclusion. So I'm looking at like categories of children that are the focus of human rights advocacy and law. So that would be like child soldiers, child refugees, stateless children. I might even look at the children of undocumented in the U.S. And children who are treated as adults in the court system. But in addition to my focus on those groups of children and representations, I'm also looking at several sensational or spectacular, right, picking up on the tropes in that book, cases of violence against children and their reception in the West, primarily the US and the UK. And so I've written one essay on that so far and presented on, and that's on the figure, or the girl, Malala Yousafzai, who was shot right in Pakistan by the Taliban. You probably heard about her case, so I do a whole chapter on her, and then I'll also look at Trayvon Martin. And basically those cases are going to be juxtaposed to think about the different attribution of value or visibility given to some children's lives and not others. So this is a really new part of the project, and I sincerely do welcome your questions and suggestions and resources. So what I thought I would focus on, and I'll try to go through this, not reading everything, but talking through some of the key points. I thought one way to narrow it for purposes of this presentation would be to focus on the Human Rights Watch 2012 report, No Place for Children, Child Recruitment, Forced Marriage, and Attacks on Schools in Somalia. And let me just provide a little bit of background on the history as it's summarized by the report, because I am interested in what the report presents or doesn't present and how it frames the child soldier. And from there, what I want to offer are what I'm calling human rights paradigm of vulnerability with regard to child soldiers. So that is the ways in which human rights law and human rights organizations frame the child soldier through certain notions of vulnerability or paradigms of vulnerability. So the report basically indicates that 4 million Somalis are in need of humanitarian assistance, that 1 in 4 children is malnourished, that over 1 million people have been displaced inside Somalia, and 400,000 are in refugee camps at the Kenyan border. 21 years of civil war in Somalia, the ongoing conflict with al-Shabaab and the transitional federal government, the unequal distribution of food, the use of food as a political weapon, an economy entrenched with local power brokers and warlords, coupled by the crippling effects of global markets on local economies, and of course unrelenting drought and famine throughout the South Central region, all contribute to the severity and longevity of this internationally identified humanitarian emergency. And that it's defined as such is important to my work because I'm also interested in how states of exception, which emerge out of an identified emergency, state of emergency, work as a way to frame the vulnerable subject. So I'm interested in that relationship, right, between something that, or an event that is designated as exceptional in state of exception in a humanitarian sense, and how that then limits the certain notions of vulnerability that are deployed in that context. The report documents the recruitment of children into armed conflict committed by all parties to the conflict in South Central Somalia, and specifies that neither the TFG nor the African Union mission has taken action against those responsible for the laws of war violations. Human Rights Watch calls on al-Shabaab, the TFG, and TFG-allied militias to end the recruitment of child soldiers, and for all parties to the conflict to extend the special protections that international human rights law afford children, including support for civilian rehabilitation and reintegration programs for former child soldiers. The report also calls for the establishment of a UN commission of inquiry to hold to account those responsible for violations of the laws of war. So drawing on interviews with Somali refugees in Kenya, including 81 boys and girls, the Human Rights Watch documents the dire situation for children. Consistent with usage under international law, Human Rights Watch uses the terms child and children to refer to anyone under the age of 18. The report indicates that interviews were conducted in Somali with the aid of interpreters and that the names of all interviewees have been withheld for security reasons. Human Rights Watch indicates that, quote, for security reasons, they were not able to visit any of the camps and detention facilities in Mogadishu where the TFG has been holding children formerly associated with its own forces or with al-Shabaab. With one or two exceptions, all of the recruited boys and girls with whom they spoke said that they had been recruited by al-Shabaab. According to Human Rights Watch, al-Shabaab has targeted and abducted children from schools and used schools as firing positions and students as human shields, which placed children at risk from return fire. They also report that some children joined voluntarily, but qualify that depiction by noting that voluntariness is questionable in the context of extreme poverty, hunger, and the al-Shabaab's well-known violence against those who refuse. So some of the children, and I have at least one, I think, excerpt here from one 15-year-old boy in his testimony. And I have the report with me, too, if anyone would like to see it, just to pass it around. I can look for that later. Oh, I'm on it. All right, here we go. A copy of the report. So children speak about being forced to watch executions of enemies of al-Shabaab and religious education that stress the importance of participating in jihad. They report promises of entry into paradise if they were to die a martyr. A 16-year-old boy from Mogadishu said that al-Shabaab infiltrate mosques and pretend they are Imam and use Islamic teaching to try and make you join. He said, if you refuse to join, they will kill you. One 14-year-old boy now in Kenya said, quote, I tried to refuse, but I couldn't. I just had to go with them, al-Shabaab, that is. If you refuse, maybe sometimes they come and kill you or harm you, so I just went with them. Some children reported that they were recruited by family members, and others point to bribery tactics, such as offerings of cash or mobile phones, and others said that they were forced to terrorize anyone considered to have breached al-Shabaab's rules, which included businesses opening during prayer time, women wearing what were deemed inappropriate clothing, young people listening to music, etc. And in the report, they define these different groups that are involved in the conflict. So they do provide definitions early on if anybody wants to look at that. So I thought I'd begin the presentation with this report because it raises several issues that are key to thinking about transnational configurations of children's human rights in conflict-affected zones, for thinking about children as political subjects and group-differentiated vulnerabilities. The figure of the child soldier foregrounds the viability, I think, of vulnerability for understanding the paradoxes of international human rights law and the normative narratives that shape the recognition of children as righted subjects, that is, as subjects with rights. The figure of the child soldier reveals the critical possibilities as well as the shortcomings of vulnerability as a heuristic tool for understanding the social forces behind the uneven distribution of rights. So one of the things that I aim to do in my work is to pull together vulnerability as a heuristic as it's used here in the Institute and by previous and past, by current and past scholars, and to bring it into a rhetorical methodology which is looking at contingencies, like what is going on in any rhetorical or material situation that impinges upon the representation of the child soldier. That is, what are the contingencies that shape recognition of the child soldier as a vulnerable subject. So I aim to mobilize vulnerability as part of a rhetorical methodology that attends to contingencies of legally and culturally driven representations of children's human rights, specifically the right to security of person. Of late, legal theorists have turned to the concept of human vulnerability as an alternative to identity-based paradigms of justice. And I probably don't need to review this whole paragraph because this is the work that you have contributed to the conversation, Martha. So I'm correct, right, that I wouldn't need to review that for this group. No. So I'll just pick up on some of the arguments that you make that I think are particularly helpful for my project. And one would be when you argue that under a vulnerability analysis, the state has an obligation not to tolerate a system that unduly privileges any group of citizens over others. So you're looking right to the state to lessen human vulnerability through institution and policies, and to imagine a more collective and institutionally shared notion of dependencies. But what I think sometimes gets overlooked in your work, although you might think differently, is that you are accounting for differences in power, circumstances, and ability. And sometimes I think some of the responses to your work have been unfair, when they say that you're universalizing vulnerability. I actually don't think you're doing that at all. But anyway, that's a footnote. And the reason why that's important to me, though, is because in my work, I need to look at those differences, right, in power, and how they play out at the level of representation. Now, within the field of children's rights, the turn to vulnerability surfaces in the configuration of the discourse of childhood dependence. For example, Jessica Kolnich argues that a normal human condition can no longer be a justification for the exclusion of some humans from the common political culture. This position is resonant with the turn to vulnerability in feminist legal studies and precarity in critical theory as the basis for understanding our obligations to each other. In Frames of War, Judith Butler emphasizes, quote, the life of the one is bound to the life of the other, and certain obligations emerge from the most basic social conditions. Now, in Butler's work, she differentiates precariousness from precarity, and I want to just put those out there to also maybe, so we can discuss later, what is the relationship between vulnerability as a concept or heuristic, as this institute is kind of deploying it and scholars associated with it, and what Butler is putting forward. Where are the overlaps? Because I actually think there are some overlaps, again, that have not been recognized. Butler claims that precariousness relies on a concept of the body as fundamentally dependent on and conditioned by a sustained and sustainable world, whereas precarity designates that politically induced condition in which certain populations suffer from failing social economic networks of support and become differentially exposed to injury, violence, and death. So as I understand some of the work I've read of yourself, Martha, and Brian Turner, and I'm thinking of Katie Oliverio, who was here, right, her essay on moral vulnerability. I see a lot of overlap between Butler's notion of precarity and vulnerability as it's used here, but I'd be interested to know if you're thinking, no, that's not what we're doing. Similarly, I argue that we cannot embrace the precarity of humanity without accounting for the disparate distribution of the status of the vulnerable subject. So that's what I'm really interested in. Who gets to be termed or labeled or perceived as a vulnerable subject? What are the conditions or the contingencies required to perceive someone as such? And in this case, it's the child soldier I'm thinking of. And because vulnerability is the term more readily used in human rights discourse, I'm actually holding on to that and not deferring to the term precarity or not substituting it. In Vulnerability as a Concept of International Human Rights Law, Alexander Marawa points to the centrality of the concept of vulnerability in human rights law. The criteria for determining vulnerability under human rights law, she argues, the criteria are interrelated and include, among other identity categories and social markers, age, gender, legitimacy, ethnicity, and health, to name only a few. Vulnerability as a heuristic in international human rights law inevitably creates a hierarchy of vulnerability, she argues, or of social groups deemed especially vulnerable. Children are among the social groups that states have an obligation to protect, of course, but there are subgroups of children who are the special focus of human rights campaigns, and who, as the Convention on the Rights of the Child articulates, may be especially vulnerable to experiencing disparities in the enjoyment of their rights. So I want to think about vulnerability and the designation of particular individuals and social groups as especially vulnerable, as pointing not only to insecurity of living condition and embodiment, but as a rhetorical process of designating or recognizing legal and social subjectivity. In this regard, I do draw on the insights of feminist scholars in critical theory who are grappling with the term precarity and affiliated terms. I argue that the socio-political distribution of the status of the vulnerable subject in human rights law and advocacy is predicated on hierarchies of recognition and identity-based norms. For example, the marginalized status of children born of wartime rape in Bosnia illustrates the gravity of the alliance between the identity-driven discourses of international human rights law and exclusionary nationalisms. In a really remarkable book, if you haven't read it and are interested in this topic, a scholar named Charlie Carpenter, writes about the human rights agenda setting in Bosnia. And one of the things that she looks at, her book is called Forgetting Children Born of War, is how children born of wartime rape were marginalized in the human rights advocacy and discourse on the ground because of all of the attention to the women as victims of rape. And of course, it's a good thing that there's the recognition of rape warfare, rape is a crime of war against women, but a kind of inadvertent consequence was that the children born of rape warfare were not given the same kind of status or recognition. And one of the reasons why...
Can you just make that a little more concrete?
Yeah.
What happened?
What happened there was that in order for the female rape victims to be recognized under the legal concept of genocidal rape, the children had to be seen, had to hold on to the kind of patrilineage of the rapist. So they were given the identity of the rapist, right? And then became further stigmatized in the society because now they were not considered the ethnic identity of the mother, but of the rapist father. So there's like this conundrum there between needing to establish under genocide law, right, that there's genocide going on based on a social group category, right? So that the child of rape was designated as Serbian, say, for example, right? Whereas
why did the child have to be designated as that in order for the mother to get what benefit?
Well, what Carpenter argues is that the articulation of ethnic identity, right, fits the requirements of the Geneva Convention, which defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. So what happened is that just as the moment that the female rape victims become subjects of international law, they also become, she argues, conduits, carriers of essentialist, ultranationalist ethnic identities in the eyes of the law. Right? So it's not just that they are raped, it's that rape is genocide because the birth of their child is no longer their ethnicity. So again, what she argues is that the focus on female rape victims may have brought the issue of gender violence to a global audience, which is a major achievement, but it led to the classification of their children as tools of biological warfare rather than as ontological beings in their own right. So I'm not, in her case, in her study, it's not so much that the children are not given legal recognition, I don't think, as children. It's more that they're ostracized in the society because of that link to that identity. And that she was saying that UNICEF and other groups that were on the ground were not attending to that. That they were kind of, almost the sacrifice in focusing on.
And this identification of the child as of the same ethnicity as the rapist father, this is something that would not have happened in their culture, but for this category, this particular understanding of genocide? Because if it would happen in the culture, without regard to that particular understanding of genocide, then it's hard to lay that at the table of that understanding of genocide, right? So what do we know about how these children would have been identified, if the culture insists on identifying people in terms of their ethnicity, and habitually identifies the children in terms of the ethnicity of the father?
Right. That's not really, what I know about that region, again, this is not my area of scholarship, but reporting on her project, is that there's a lot of mixed identities. And, prior to a lot of the ethnic conflict, they weren't stigmatizing those essentialist identities as much. Yeah. Exactly. But what happened is, in the context of, feminist human rights advocates going in and trying to help these women, this was kind of a fallout that was not dealt with sufficiently. So what I see this is as a kind of look at the kind of paradoxes of feminist human rights work in such situations. And there are other situations which we can probably look at which show, that make this point that certain children are recognized as vulnerable subjects while others are not. I'm thinking of, I think it's in Frames of War, which I was reading recently. Judith Butler talks about the debate over the children and civilians who were killed under Operation, I think it's Cast Lead, or I have to let me get the right name of that. But in, December 2008 to 2009, Operation Cast Lead, which was Israeli dropping and fighting in Palestine. And there's a lot of controversy over how many were killed, civilian casualties, but among those, there were over 200 children killed. And part of the controversy in that case has to do with whether or not the children that were killed by Israeli forces, the Palestinian children, are perceived as child soldiers, as human shields, or as civilians, right? And so Butler is looking at, what qualifies one child with a certain identity, or group of children with a certain identity, to be perceived as vulnerable and in need of protection by the state under the laws of war, and when are certain children not seen as part of that narrative or that framework. So there are a lot of examples, I think, that we could use, when states impose or not a certain understanding of vulnerability or of the child, right? Barbara Harlow, another example would be, she talks about the Guantanamo child, right? That there's a child who was to come up for trial in Guantanamo who was allegedly conducted war crimes as a child. Now I believe he's 23 years. Yeah, so there are a number of cases, right, where you could turn to this differential perception of who is not vulnerable, or who should be treated as a child in the context of war or not. And I'm just interested in what are the discourses that are informing that decision or that designation, not just in the legal sense, but more in the kind of socio-political sense of media reporting about it, et cetera. So in Spectacular Rhetorics, and in my earlier work, what I look at is how human rights law and advocacy are structured by an ocular epistemology. And what I mean by that are visual constructs of recognition, witnessing among them. And how these are, the visual constructs of recognition, socio-political recognition, are intertwined with systems of identification. So one of the things that I'm doing is holding on to the identitarian logics. Right, so I'm real curious to see, Martha, what you think about that, right? Because I know part of your argument within the context of domestic law and domestic policy in the US, right, is to be kind of moving away from the identity-based discourses of equality of opportunity to equality of condition. So when we get to the international level and we think about children's human rights, what I'm seeing with regard to the case of child soldiers and children in war is that identity-based discourses and logics are thoroughly at play. Now maybe they need not be, but they are, right, in terms of who is designated as a victim or perpetrator, or even viewed as a human being rather than as a human shield. So what I'm starting to see in this report, in the Human Rights Watch report, No Place for Children, is that they're framing the way in which we think of the child soldier in at least three ways. And I also see this in literature, so in the memoirs about child soldiers that are so popular. And again, this is what I want to propose and get some feedback on. It seems to me that there might be a human rights paradigm of vulnerability at work here, which is defined by, one, a moral universalism, which is grounded in Western notions of child development. So I went through this already. Moral universalism. A concept of legal personhood as belated, which is grounded in notions of subjection and trauma, and, of course, bodily injury. And in the case of child soldiers, rehabilitation or recovery, and the designation of a failed or fragile nation state that's unable to protect its children. So for the first one, moral universalism, I'm looking at the cover, for example, of that report, which I can pull up here again, too. I think I have it as the first. So what we get are two young boys dressed in oversized adult army fatigues, black masks with large assault weapons in hand, right? So the cover is basically, in some ways, visually depicting the child that's overcome, right? Overclothed with the adult army fatigues. The cover clearly signifies the child as a perpetrator of violence, and basically what the entire report does is strip the child of that political identity into that of a more neutral, vulnerable child. And what I'm saying then is that moral universalism underwrites human rights law here, namely the optional protocol for the prevention of the recruitment of children into armed forces, by stripping away the children's political identity. Within human rights and humanitarian discourses on the child soldier, childhood innocence is suspended in time. It's a condition that humanitarian intervention, directed by international law in the form of social and psychological support, intends to correct. And you see this a lot in the memoirs, like A Long Way Gone and War Child, where the former child soldier depicts himself as in need of reclaiming a lost or stolen childhood. So the kind of narrative trajectory is often child perpetrator back to child, vulnerable subject, before that former child soldier then becomes, in many cases, a human rights witness or activist. So that's often the kind of narrative trajectory. And what's interesting, and what scholars in literary studies and comparative literature have shown in their work on human rights, on child soldier memoirs, is that a lot of the memoirs are following the trajectory of the optional protocol. Like, so they're looking at the law itself as a narrative, right, as imbuing a certain set of transformations, right, and that part of the goal there is social integration and recovery, right? There's a lot of focus on that in the memoirs of going through rehab, psychological support, etc. So what some scholars are doing, Joey Slaughter, Alexandra Moore, I'm trying to think of others, Elizabeth Goldberg, and these are people in literature and English studies, are trying to look at the parallels between international law and then what happens in the memoirs and even novels that are most popular in the West. And they're seeing a lot of mimicry there, a lot of mirroring between the law and the literature. And it makes sense in some regards, right? Because if the law is saying we need to have more rehabilitation of the child soldier and integration and treat the child soldier as a victim, not as a perpetrator, et cetera, and that these former child soldiers are engaged in those support services, that they're beneficiaries of them in many cases, that's going to be part of their narrative. Right, so what I think is really interesting is that kind of link, that synthesis that we're seeing between international humanitarian and human rights law and the child soldier, and then what we're getting in the human rights memoirs.
Why is that surprising?
It's not. That's what I'm saying.
So if that's not the problem, if it's not surprising, then what is the problem? I guess what I'm having trouble understanding is, what is the problem that's animating this discourse?
The problem I'm not seeing it as a problem. What the phenomenon is the mimicry. I mean, so that's what's interesting. And then for the person in my field, right, we're saying, well, why is there uptake? Why is there so much popularity? Why are these in the best-selling list? Why are they offered in Starbucks, right? So part of the uptake, the Western American interest in these stories, is that it's replicating a certain liberal notion of the child, right. Western notion of the child, right. That we find very compelling and comfortable.
Is that notion of the child problematic?
It's definitely problematic if you could think of ethnography and anthropological work, yeah, because
it's not a universal.
Right.
But why is the fact that it's not a universal notion of the child, why does that make problematic the Western notion of the child? Are we incapable of making normative judgments about different understandings of childhood and
Well,
what childhood flourishing is and the like. I mean, I don't have an investment in any side of the discourse. I'm just trying to it's not very familiar to me. I'm trying to understand what's animating it.
well, first we have to think about your question. What's animating it? What is it?
You've
Right?
got a project, right? And you're here talking to us about your project and about the other scholars. And in my experience, scholars typically focus on things that interest them, problems of some kind, and so I'm trying to understand what is the concern here? Is it that we're universalizing a conception of childhood that is compromised in some way? We shouldn't be imposing this on human rights law and making it the standard by which others are judged? I'm just...
Well, I mean, that's certainly part of the history, right, of critiques of human rights law, right, and human rights advocacy, is that it has been inflicted on non-Western populations and that they're Western constructs of childhood that are being imposed. I'm not a human rights advocate, and I'm not writing a manual. What someone like myself does, right, is look at discourse. So what I'm looking at is how certain discourses of the figure of the child, and in this case vulnerability, right, and violence, get mobilized in certain cultural arenas, and then why audiences, I'm interested in why audiences might be so fascinated, interested, compelled, right, persuaded by such narratives. Now, is there a problem? I mean...
So you're not suggesting the narrative is something to be criticized or disestablished? You're not necessarily...
Well, I'm critical of it.
But that's not a presupposition of the work as you described it.
It's not a presupposition.
Yeah,
I mean...
You just described roughly a project, and I take it was not you yourself may have views about these matters, but it wasn't a presupposition of the project.
Right, no.
That conception of childhood needs to be disestablished or replaced or...
I mean, I think yes, but that's not what the goal of the project is. Yes, my view is
It can
yes.
also show what's missing, what's obscured, what's overlooked by one particular
Right.
construct. So, and I think it just as the example about rape and genocide indicates, actually the one framing creates a whole set of other problems, or overlooks a whole set
Right.
of other problems. So
Right, I'm interested in that.
The
What's...
critical aspect of the
That's very
project
interesting.
itself.
So that the conception
Yeah.
may blind us
Yes.
to something
Yes.
that we focus
Yeah,
on.
so that's, but I think, that's what.
Yeah.
Yeah, and well, that's the case, like, for example, with Malala Yousafzai, which might be more readily, available to us as a group to think about, I don't know. But in that case, right, and she's an amazing young woman, but in her case, right, one of the reasons why I would argue that she has so much uptake and interest in the US and the UK is because she is more like us than she is like other Muslim women in the third world, right? That what she espouses, or at least the way in which it's mobilized and what is taken out of her discourse, is that which supports our own liberal kind of international worldview. Is that a bad thing or a good thing? Well, that's another conversation. Right now, I'm interested in what is getting, where our focus is, and what we don't get. So what we don't get by that emphasis, right, on, let's say, the right to education, which is clearly what Malala is for, right? What we don't get, though, in only seeing that, we're not hearing the other part of her argument, which I think is quite radical, and which is you must have peace before you can have education, right? She has been critical of, for example, the drone strikes, the NATO-led back drone strikes on her Swat Valley and the area in which she is from, right? Civilian casualties there. Making schools even more dangerous for girls to go to, not less dangerous. But we don't hear a lot about that in the mass media, let's say, coverage of her, right? Some of it's in her memoir, but it's also been written out of that. What gets focused on instead is, first of all, her vulnerability. Look, she was shot by the Taliban, and that story then bolsters and helps justify Western intervention in the region, when in fact she's saying, part of the reason I was shot is because that's exacerbating Right? So what I'm interested, maybe a better way to grapple with it, or an easier one, because it's in the media more presently, is exactly what you're saying, is by having a certain focus. I call it uptake, but, like almost fetishization of an individual or a category of a child, and configuring that individual in a certain way to complement our own already our actions or our beliefs, not me as an individual, but let's say that the more kind of national or even international discourse.
Your own question, which really has to do with why are these memoirs so gripping, and it's an attempt to develop empathy, and we are more empathic with children than we would be with adults who may have been put under entirely the same kinds of constraints, but somehow when they magically became adults, they were able to do something different, and we're not so sympathetic with them. So I think it's a way of, the thing that I think is always missing out of these things, and it kind of brings me back to my conversation with President Carter on this topic, was there's no discussion of autonomy, of choice. That we assume that all things being equal, the participants would have chosen differently, and I think that is probably true in many ways. But one of the things that really concerned him, because it was a whole issue of rehabilitation, bringing these children now back into their communities, whatever that community looked like, and they didn't want to go.
Right.
So he had been working it was about Sudan, and he was very interested, probably still is, in the conflict in Sudan and bringing it to, appropriate closure and so forth. And what they found was, when they started to try to think about rehabilitation in the way that we would think about it as to bring them back, they didn't want to go. That they were not interested in doing that, and I think that's.
And what were the reasons given?
Well, they have formed bonds with the people who they have been fighting with, working with, whatever.
Right, kind of sense of like a substitute family almost, yeah.
Yeah, sort of like gangs,
Right.
In the work on gangs. And also, years have passed, families have died or have been dispersed for various reasons. So there is the thing that they would be going back to a community, would be radically changed from the community they left. So, and some of them had been child soldiers. They'd started, of course, when they were very young, maybe even younger than that, or there, but had grown up and they'd married in the other communities, or they have formed relationships that they didn't want to give up. And the Western notion, was, well, we're going to somehow, this is going to be a political stumbling block in arriving at peace, and they became a chit in the conversation. And actually, when you looked into it, many of these child soldiers were not wishing to be traded as a political chit.
Yeah, and I'm very interested in that, and getting that perspective of the child soldier, because you're right, we don't get in the discourse a lot of that. And when you look at the interviews, right, from this report, it confirms everything that we already believe in terms of universal childhood, what a childhood should be, notions of dependency. The whole issue of autonomy is very interesting to me, and that's also why your work is so interesting to me, too. In this regard, in terms of the child soldier and whether or not the child soldier wants to reintegrate in the way whatever that looks like. And what does that mean, right? That we are not looking at them as ontological beings, as autonomous beings.
Right.
right? And part of the reason is because we're codifying them as children, as vulnerable children. For me, to get back to your question, one of your questions, one of the things I'm interested in, and it might be, way back on the back burner now and come forward later after I work on the project some more, is a redefinition of childhood. To me, childhood must be a political identity. That's the first thing. And if a child has a political identity, I don't know if you have children. I have 2 adopted children, and they have political identities. Since they were 4.
Tell me what that means. I'm sorry.
They could be seen as having political and moral agency, autonomy to some degree. Now, I'm not as hooked up on this capacity argument, right?
So political identity is not referring to nationality.
No. Well, they should have citizenship status.
Well, I talk about its inclusion in the social contract.
Yeah.
Children are excluded
Right.
from the social
Political-
Yeah.
Okay, so political agency, political status, all right.
Wendy, I want to be sure that you get a chance to finish your talk.
Well, this is really helpful, so this is even better.
But you're going to be here tomorrow and the next day, and so there'll be chances to
Yeah,
do
well-
a bit more focused things, but I want to make sure.
Well,
you get a
what I
chance to
want to,
finish.
really what would be most helpful for me and maybe would be to just present those 3, go
Yes.
back to those
Yes,
3,
that
to
would
finish
be-
that,
yes.
and then say what needs to be added.
Okay. That would
Right,
be
I
very
mean-
helpful. Okay.
Yeah, so let's go back to what I'm noticing. Actually, I think it was back here for this breakdown. Here, right? So this is where I'm starting the project, seeing these 3, I'm calling them paradigms of vulnerability, prototypes, and it seems to me that moral universalism, is long been a critique of human rights. There's a lot of work already done here, so I'm already building on a notion of moral universalism that then gets translated right to other cultures and all the problems about that, right? The universal versus the particulars. A lot of debates about all that. But what I want to bring to that conversation is just a little bit more emphasis on the notion of childhood, right, and how it's playing out in some of these cases. So that we talked about already. But this concept of legal personhood as belated is interesting to me, and I'd be just curious to know, what, from a legal perspective, how you would look at it. For me, it's very much almost hooked into this, what seems to be a psychoanalytically driven, if not, psychology-oriented, like psychoanalytically driven, almost Freudian notion of personhood that the law also, in the case of the child soldier, seems to be replicating, which is that, the identity of the child soldier as a child is belated, right? It's suspended. You haven't been a child, right? You need to reclaim your childhood. So what is involved in reclaiming that vulnerable status, right? Now, partly it's what's involved is that they're not held accountable for the crimes that they might commit. So there's a clear, what's the benefit of that, right? They cannot be held as war criminals, for example, right? Because of their age.
In order to enlist our empathy.
Yeah, and that's the key that goes through all of them, I think, the empathy. And then, of course, there's the part of the vulnerable nation is more of the kind of the strategic mobilization of the figure of the child soldier in order to further denigrate or even stereotype African countries, nations, right, as being failed nation states, as fragile. So a lot of what I see happening here with the child soldier discourse is like a replication of colonial rhetorics almost, right? That the child soldier becomes a metonym, like stands in for the failure of the state to protect its own children. Right? Now again, it's not saying that there's not a reality to that. It's saying what happens when that becomes almost a mythos, right, that then disperses into the culture. Right? How does that limit our understanding of the child soldier's situation, and possibly, not possibly, and also the role of other nations in the failure of that, of any given nation, right, or of the international community's failure, right? So the transformation narrative is this belated, the second one, legal personhood as belated. That's just something I notice in all the discourse. of cinema, like War Child, the film War Child, the memoir War Child, Ishmael Bey's A Long Way Gone. I mean, a lot of the most popular pieces on child soldiers is about the transformation of that individual, singular child soldier, the rehabilitation, often difficult, full of trials and tribulations. It's just like the old-fashioned Bildungsroman, right, in literature. The German coming-of-age story, which is now the former child soldier coming of age. But the problem, or the difference between like the traditional literary narrative is it's not like a straight moving from the child let's say a man who goes to war and after going to war becomes a man as a rite of passage, right? It's no, child soldier, as a perpetrator must reclaim childhood before they can move, so it's like a different narrative trajectory. So I'm just interested in that. What does it do to the whole genre of the coming of age narrative? And these are super popular in schools. My kids, 9-year-old and 15-year-old, have both been heavily involved with former child soldiers in Ohio, coming to the schools, reading their books, doing 5K things for support. It's like thoroughly part of the curriculum. What is that about? I'm super interested in that. What is that about, that the child soldier, Bildungsroman, is now part of the public school curriculum in the United States? It's full of the, in a lot of middle schools and high schools curriculum. So I guess, it would just be really looking at what else needs to be added here, or what else does a vulnerability analytic offer for understanding the way in which I would say the figure of the child soldier becomes a fetish almost, right? And you keep bringing up, right, empathy. Right, and I think this transformation narrative is not only an empathic narrative, right, but it's inspirational. So there's also a discourse of what is inspiring, right, that's being mobilized here. So I'm thinking, what needs to be added to this list in terms of paradigms of vulnerability or other ways in which vulnerability could help me think through the complications of the figure of the child soldier. See, I'm thinking of it as a figure, so the rhetorical dispersal of that figure, the image of the child soldier, in, let's say, American culture and politics.
I've felt 1,000 reactions. So
Well, good.
We'll talk about it over the next couple of days, but just a few here. I think one of the things when you talk about it, limited understanding of what's going on, the human rights community fails to see what it might be doing wrong in Africa. I also think that there's a way in which human rights discourse allows us to fail to examine our own institutions. So I'm thinking about the parallels between the child soldier and the gang member in America.
Yeah.
And I do think that there are parallels there, and that you can think about them. Again, my project is to universalize, is to not to look at the particular, although I recognize the particularity in terms of talking about differences in regard to the placement within webs of relationships. Both differences, I like to talk about embedded differences, and I like to talk about embodied differences. So there are two categories of differences that really matter.
Tell me what you mean by embedded. Is that the social?
We are embodied creatures. And I think that this is where the precarity that Butler talks about is very much located in that. But we're also embedded in social relationships and institutions. And it's
right,
that
the social part.
It's the second part that's of more interest to our vulnerability, my vulnerability project. That may answer for everybody else. But,
right.
Because it's
right.
more of a political theory than it is, or an ethic. It's a way to kind of think about them. So, again, I would take this idea of child soldier and look not only to what's going on, but look at the human rights at the Western societies and the analogous institutions in there is making the point that all nations are vulnerable to this exploitation or approach to childhood and childhood violence, however you want to describe it.
That's perfect.
But I got it myself.
No, really, it's perfect because, yeah, I mean,
But no, that's true. I mean,
It
it's a
is.
game and
No,
no,
well, I-
it is a perfect
But again,
comparison.
yes, but again, this is what the
Yeah.
vulnerability project is
Right.
to broaden exactly that. So,
Mhm.
and I have some things that I want you to read, some recent stuff that might be helpful too, just in kind of thinking about this. So the whole idea of vulnerable subjects as distinct groups, I think it has to be resisted, because one of the strengths of the vulnerability analysis, and there are a couple, one I think that it doesn't get stated a lot, is that it really takes a life course perspective. So this whole question of reclaiming a vulnerable state, I would understand that as the necessity to, as you go through life from childhood onward, even before childhood, in her utero, to gain the resources or aspects of resilience that allow us to both survive harm and hurt, but also to take advantage of opportunities, because we need resilience in order to take risks, in order to take advantage of opportunities. And if that's denied to you, then there's very little in the way that you can make those up. So, and I talk about institutions as providing those resources and as not only sequential, and also as simultaneously in operation. So if you miss out on education, for example, it's very hard then to collect the resources you need to start a family, to have a career, to retire. I mean, so it depends on your successful completion of earlier stages.
So what would you say then about something that I do think we're seeing in like the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is an understanding of integration, right, into society based on the reclamation of vulnerability first. So
I don't think you can do that. And again,
so you're critical of the whole human rights framework on that account.
On that account, and again, rights are important for some things, but I think the problem is the reliance on a rights paradigm, which is very focused on individuals, focused on the moment of harm,
Yes.
and not on the development over the life course. So that the vulnerability analysis would say, far from looking at that individual child soldier, let's look at the entire institutional arrangements of the society and see if they're actually functioning in a way that allows individuals to gain the resilience that they need, which is a larger, larger social critique than that. So,
but it's a critique of human rights to a degree.
It is a comment on the limitations of human rights.
Yeah.
It's like
That's where I want to come in, right on that point. Right.
Just as we need one person, one vote, equal pay for work, all of those sorts of things. But that is not, and we need anti-discrimination laws, which is what human rights has actually turned into by and large, and that's the use of categories. But just as we need those things, they are necessary but not sufficient to get at the real structural inequalities that exist, and in this country as well as others. I have a whole lot of more things, but I won't let other people just have to.
Well, I mean,
the scales are falling from my eyes. Trying to understand this discourse, listening to this talk. I mean, there's a lot out there that I need to learn about and think about.
but I mean, what's so interesting and frustrating about human rights discourse, right, is the goal of universality. I mean, was the initial goal, right, in a way, and as you say, just over the last 60, 70 years, right, it has become more particularized into an identity-based structure. You can just look at the history of the laws, right? So even when we have these optional protocols of child soldiers, and the dealing of, let's say, child refugees, these special cases, right, where you would think, I mean, to some degree it seems as if they are using more of a vulnerability paradigm that you would present, say. But it's not ending up like that when you look at the discourse. It becomes so singular, individualized, and filtered through these very, really American even, not just Western, American notions of citizenship, of what's inspiring. it keeps getting smaller and smaller.
I know, I agree with that, totally. I actually have a few things that I've written that are related to that. I mean, they're not exactly what I know, but they're related to that whole idea.
Looking at that is, there's a lot of things written about how children's minds work differently from adults and so forth. And in the criminal field, of course, in the field of juvenile delinquency, it frequently becomes an issue whether or not a child who commits an offense that otherwise would be a serious offense to an adult, when they reach that moment of knowing that what they did was wrong, or the kind of impulse control that might be required. And I wonder whether or not in these narratives there's ever been any kind of thinking about that. Because it seems to me that sometimes these children are being excused based on their individual narrative. Their individual narrative, and excuse is not really the right word. I can't think what the right word is. But because we're looking at it from a Western perspective, we're looking at guilt, we're projecting guilt and innocence and excusing them from some acts because we would, based on our understanding of juvenile development, we would take that into consideration. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, what I've read about that, because I'm looking for other perspectives on it, right?
Yeah.
So I have found a study, I can't recall, I might have it in my bibliography, I can check, where an advocate scholar is suggesting that his experience in interviews with former child soldiers is that the reintegration rehabilitation model does not allow them to take accountability for the atrocities they committed, and that it in fact is not helpful move to go back to the vulnerable. You didn't know what you were doing, it's not your fault, you were a child, kind of therapy, which comes out, it's more likely that that's the therapy that comes out in the books that I've read, where you do get the imposition, and it is always of a Western woman, it seems, white woman, who's coming in these narratives and saying, it's okay, Ishmael, you were only a child when you did that. And you get these former child soldiers, or they're not even former yet, these men in these homes, these recovery homes, or whatever you might call them, houses, that are resisting that like crazy. I mean, there's so much violence even in the houses, because they're just trying to work through all this, right? So what I've seen are the critiques which say that that's not a good approach. Right. That it needs to be more like like the Reconciliation or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, just some kind of like public ownership, if we want to call it that, of the atrocities that one has committed.
Yeah, I think that's got to be important to this community.
But that's not part of that international human rights framework at all.
I guess I don't,
to this.
Maybe I just don't understand the international human rights framework that you're talking about. My focus on it is very rarefied, but it seems to me that what you were just now talking about with Jan is an example of how a misunderstanding of the problem and what to do about it can lead people to do the wrong thing. But that's not, what we used to say in high school in debate, that's not inherent. You can imagine
an alternative.
Somebody who's working within a human rights framework, or just put that aside for a moment, who becomes enlightened and realizes that there is a better way to deal with it.
I'm sure lots of people on the ground realize it.
Right, you don't have to abandon the quote human rights framework.
The human rights framework that I'm talking about is the particular optional protocol on the recruitment of children into armed forces, which is part of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is what is getting mobilized. And that protocol requires states and the international community to rehabilitate and reintegrate the child soldier back into society. I'm just going by that article.
And that's being interpreted as somehow requiring strategies that are misguided.
I think it's really informed by a kind of Western psychoanalytic framework, frankly, about belatedness, about trauma, about injury,
Well,
and that subjectivity must be based on
That would be
that.
a very, I can imagine somebody who is passionately involved in international
Mm-hmm.
human rights in some sense, devoting herself passionately to that critique, right?
Well, that's part of the second one for
I
me.
mean,
That is part of that
it's
critique.
the sense I get of either or that makes me very uncomfortable. Like Martha was talking about, we need rights, but it's not enough. Well, of course it's not enough. And in fact, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the provisions in the South African Constitution, all of that literature, which is a burgeoning literature now, is very fertile ground for vulnerability discourse. Vulnerability discourse doesn't compete with it, but rather it can inhabit it and improve it.
Well, that's what I want to say, but I do think the human rights, I think it is a framework. I mean, framework, I think, already believes they are doing that in positioning these children, let's in this case, as vulnerable. But the notion, you see what I mean? But it's a notion of vulnerability that perhaps is maybe just not only informed by, Western notions of childhood development, right, and coming of age narratives, if we want the literary part of it, but a notion of vulnerability that perhaps is very legalistic,
It's much narrower than we.
much narrower than, yeah.
And vulnerability is.
It's 18 and under, or
It's
15
used-
and under.
And it's used quite often as a substitute for things like discrimination or, dependency, or people would call things vulnerability that we would not, again, just as a theoretical matter.
I must say, it was helpful to me at the end for you to clarify precisely what legal principles you're talking about and with what relationship to, because while I enjoyed the paper, much of it was at such a level of abstraction. I wasn't entirely always sure what kind of connections you were trying to make with other specific human rights laws or what you were trying to critique. So maybe that's part of Michael's frustration here. Right? That there's like a lot going on, but
A lot of I feel like I need so much translation.
yeah. Well, so I think like tethering it to the very specific critiques you want to make will be very helpful, right? Because then it allows whether it's a legal reader or a humanities reader to be able to sort of understand precisely. Because I guess, and I appreciate you taking child soldiers as this limit concept, in this like gammon frame, to demarcate sort of some of the limits of empathy or of law or of capacity to engage. But I wondered how you think that differs from the rhetorics and discourses that are surrounded, for example, women, right? So like Spivak's famous notion of white men saving brown women from brown men. I mean, it seemed to me a lot of these could actually be applicable in.
Oh, yeah, it's
a
part
gender
of that
concept
discourse,
as
I
well.
think.
So
It's saving the child, not only from the
so
the mother as well.
So you're looking at child soldiers as this figure, right? And you're sort of plucking that out in demonstrating it as exceptional in this exceptional state, right? So there's all these like levels of exceptionality going on, and you're trying to analyze the discourses around it. But I wonder if there's a necessary connection between those two. If those discourses of Western superiority or of empathy or of human rights or of all these spectacular rhetorics that you're analyzing around it aren't more closely tied to those very exceptions, right? So gender, so children, so anything that is deemed worthy of that humanity or of that care. I'm just not sure if it has to be necessarily child soldiers, which is the ones that actually function as this limited concept in the way that you want it to. It seems like it could be.
Oh, no, there are a lot of figures that could, yeah. But, the analytical, selection for the project is to look at categories that human rights law and human rights activists are using with regard to children. So, it just happens to be, it's not arbitrary, but it's still selective, right? So that's why it's the child soldier. And I'll do the same, I want to also compare the child soldier to the figure of the child refugee, which shares some of the same exceptions, like liminality, the zone, is the child stateless, does it have legal recognition or not? But that image gets deployed in ways very differently than the child soldier, obviously. It really does. So, I can't just do this is the law, this is the representation. That's not going to work, even though I realize knowing, some of the laws are helpful. And I did have a section, which I didn't read, about all of the new laws on child soldiers, or the evolution of the law on child soldiers. But I don't want to tag it only to that. You know, what I want to see is also the discourses informing the law. So I don't want the law to be the origin. And that's what I'm working against, actually. That's the humanist perspective, I guess.
Or the law and society perspective.
Yeah,
Which is what I was.
how you would frame it,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's the impulse, to not give that, but I can see why you would need it, you know, to anchor. And it could be a place to start and then just break it down from there. You know, like start the whole piece with, like the optional protocol, right, Article 5 or whatever.
Put it in the footnote, that's good.
Is that what you mean, though, like,
Yeah, I guess just some of your language and the way that you framed it, saying that this was the limited concept or something specific or spectacularly unique about child soldiers, and that didn't seem to be either evident or necessary, given that you're doing a broader project of critiquing these kinds of spectacular discourses.
yeah, it'll be one of many, I think. Yeah.
Well, you are going to be here for.
Yes, so thank you for, I'm going to be here till Saturday morning.
Plus, I know you're part of the festivities.
Yeah, and I also want to go to the workshop, see
And
what's
also,
happening there.
you'll be in the FLT Scholar Suite on the third floor of the library. But thank you. This was
Thank you. Thank you all very much.